The gravel crunched under the tires of William Harrison's truck, a sound that seemed too loud in the heavy silence of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Stillwater Creek Farm wasn't a place of new beginnings. It felt more like an ending. The main house slumped against the hillside, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin to reveal the grey, weathered wood beneath. A porch sagged on one side, a silent surrender to gravity and time. Weeds, thick and determined, had reclaimed the garden, choking out any memory of what once grew there. William, a man of 42 who felt twice that age, stepped out of the truck. His shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with the toolbox in his hand. He looked at the dilapidated structure, his own internal decay mirrored in the rotting wood and broken windows, and wondered if he was building a future or just a bigger tomb. He held his 7-year-old daughter Chloe's hand, her small fingers a fragile anchor in his turbulent world. The front door groaned in protest as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through the dusty air inside. He expected emptiness, the scent of mice and forgotten memories, a blank canvas on which he could force a new life. Instead, his eyes met 2 pairs of startled ones. In the far corner of the living room, huddled near a grimy fireplace, stood 2 girls. The older one, maybe 19, immediately stepped in front of the younger, her body a defiant shield. Her face was a mask of hard-earned distrust, her clothes worn and practical. The younger girl, perhaps 16, peeked from behind her sister, her large eyes wide with a terror that felt ancient and deeply familiar. They weren't just trespassers, they were ghosts who had been disturbed. A surge of anger, hot and possessive, rose in William's chest. This was his property, his one tangible piece of a plan to fix what was broken. The words, "Get out," formed on his lips, a harsh command to reclaim his space, but they never came out. His gaze locked with the younger girl's, with Grace's. In the depths of her eyes, he didn't see defiance or malice. He saw the same bottomless chasm of loss that he saw in the mirror every morning, the same hollowed-out fear that haunted his own daughter's sleep. The anger vanished, replaced by a painful, gut-wrenching recognition. He saw 2 orphans, abandoned and scared, and he remembered that his own sweet Chloe was, in her own way, an orphan too. The confrontation he had prepared for died in his throat, choked by an empathy he hadn't known he still possessed. The silence that fell over the room was heavier than the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. No one moved. Clara's defensive posture remained, a fragile fortress of a girl protecting her last treasure. William stood paralyzed in the doorway, a man caught between the ghost of his past and the unexpected reality of his present. The air was thick with the unspoken stories of grief, each person in the room a survivor of a different shipwreck, now washed ashore in the same desolate place. It's in moments like these, when one person's pain sees itself in another's, that you realize how connected we all are. If you've ever felt that kind of profound, silent understanding, you know how powerful these stories are, and subscribing is the one small gesture that helps us keep telling them. The heavy silence was finally broken by William's voice, quieter than he intended, rough with unshed grief. He cleared his throat and looked not at Clara's defiant stare, but at the dusty floorboards between them. He explained who he was, that this place was his now, a broken-down dream for him and his daughter. He spoke of his wife, Sarah, in the past tense, the words catching in his throat like burrs. He didn't offer charity, he offered a partnership. He needed help, more than he could admit, to make this shell a home again. He told them they could stay in the small guest cottage out back, earn their keep by helping him with the repairs. It wasn't a command or an eviction notice. It was a lifeline thrown from one sinking ship to another, a desperate, clumsy attempt to build a raft big enough for all of them. He saw Sarah everywhere in the farm's decay. He remembered the day they'd found the listing online, her face lit by the glow of the laptop screen. She had sketched out plans for a sprawling vegetable garden where the weeds now stood thick and tangled. She wanted chickens, a tire swing hanging from the old oak, and a porch where they could watch Chloe chase fireflies on summer nights. The accident had been sudden, a mess of twisted metal and flashing lights on a rain-slicked highway. Now, every peeling strip of paint, every shattered window pane felt like a personal accusation. He wasn't just fixing a house, he was trying to piece back together a future she was supposed to be in. The guilt was a constant, heavy companion, whispering that by building this new life without her, he was somehow erasing the one they had shared. The first week was a fragile truce, a dance of avoidance held together by the shared language of hard work. They communicated through the scrape of shovels, the thud of hammers, and the groan of rotting wood being torn free. William watched the sisters from a distance, learning their rhythms. Clara was a force of nature, her movements efficient and strong, her hands already calloused from a life that had demanded too much, too soon. She never complained, her silence a wall of formidable competence. Grace was her shadow, quieter and more observant. She would often pause her work to sketch in a small, battered notebook, capturing the way the light fell on a rusted hinge or the determined face of a wildflower pushing through a crack in the foundation. Chloe, in her innocent way, became the sole diplomat, flitting between them all, her chatter a bright thread stitching their solitudes together. One evening, over a meager dinner of canned soup and stale bread eaten on the dusty porch steps, William tried to bridge the silence. He asked them where they were from, a simple question that hung in the air like smoke. Clara's jaw tightened, her answer a clipped, one-word summary of a town they'd left behind. But then Grace, her voice soft as moth wings, spoke of their mother's garden. She described the scent of tomato vines in the sun and the specific shade of blue on the hydrangeas her mother had loved. For a fleeting moment, the hard lines of Clara's face softened, a flicker of a shared, beautiful memory. William felt a pang of recognition, the familiar ache of a love that lives on only in stories. It was a tiny crack in the armor, a shared understanding that grief, like a garden, needs tending. The farm itself seemed determined to test their fragile alliance. A week into the repairs, a rusted pipe in the kitchen wall gave way in the dead of night. They were woken by the sound of gushing water, a miniature waterfall cascading onto the floorboards and threatening to flood the entire ground floor. Panic seized William for a moment, the overwhelming sense of another thing breaking that he couldn't fix. But Clara was already moving, her voice sharp and clear in the darkness, directing him to the main water shutoff outside, while she and Grace used old towels and buckets to stymie the deluge. They worked as a team, their movements synchronized by the urgency of the crisis, the cold water soaking their clothes and binding them in a shared, frantic purpose. They finally stopped the flood just as the first hints of dawn were painting the sky, leaving them exhausted, shivering, and surrounded by a sodden mess. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, a strange sense of victory settled over them. They had faced a disaster together and won. They were no longer just three strangers and a child sharing a roof. They were a crew that had weathered a storm, however small. It's in these moments of shared struggle, when you're fighting side by side against the chaos, that you discover who your people truly are. If you believe in the power of these connections forged in hardship, subscribing is the most meaningful way to help us continue to share these powerful stories of found family. Their isolation was soon broken by the arrival of a dust-covered pickup truck belonging to a neighbor, a man named Henderson, whose family had lived down the road for generations. He'd come bearing a pie and a dozen questions, his eyes lingering on Clara and Grace with unconcealed suspicion. He spoke to William in condescending tones, making pointed remarks about the wisdom of taking in two strange girls, his words laced with veiled warnings about reputation and liability. The judgment was a palpable thing, a suffocating blanket of small-town gossip that threatened to smother their delicate new beginning. William stood his ground, his voice even but firm, explaining that they were his help, his partners in this reclamation project. He was defending them, and in doing so, he realized he was defending the very idea of this new, unconventional family. Clara had been within earshot, and Henderson's words were like salt in an old wound. Later that day, the distrust was back in her eyes, harder than ever. She cornered William by the barn, her voice low and accusatory. She asked him what he really wanted from them, if this was all some kind of twisted charity case he could boast about to his friends, or worse. The confrontation was raw and painful, stripping away the easy camaraderie they had started to build. It forced William to be truly honest, not just with her, but with himself. He confessed his own profound loneliness, the crushing emptiness of the house, and the desperate hope that by filling it with life, any life, he might begin to feel alive again himself. He wasn't saving them, he admitted. He was trying to save himself. The true test came during a violent summer thunderstorm that rolled in from the mountains without warning. The wind howled and the rain hammered against the roof, but it was the deafening crack of thunder that broke something inside of Grace. She crumpled to the floor, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the storm outside. She was trapped in a memory, her small hands clenched as if trying to ward off an unseen blow. A panic attack, fierce and all-consuming, had taken hold. William froze, the sight of her suffering dredging up his own feelings of helplessness from the night he lost Sarah. He was paralyzed by the fear of failing again, of being unable to protect someone who depended on him. It was Clara who knelt beside her sister, but her own fear made her frantic. She didn't know how to reach her. Pushing past his own panic, William moved to Grace's other side. He didn't try to reason with her or ask what was wrong. Instead, he began to speak in a low, steady voice, just as he did when Chloe had a nightmare. He described the pattern of the wood grain on the floor beneath her fingers. He talked about the sound of the rain, not as a threat, but as a song the old house was singing. He grounded her in the tangible world, one small, solid detail at a time, pulling her back from the precipice of her trauma. Watching someone choose gentleness in the face of raw fear is a powerful thing. We believe these moments of profound empathy are what connect us all, and your subscription helps ensure these vital stories continue to be told. Slowly, miraculously, Grace's breathing evened out. Her gaze cleared, focusing on William's face, and she leaned into his side, exhausted but present. The storm inside her had passed. Later that night, long after the rain had stopped, Clara found William on the porch. The wall she had so carefully maintained around herself finally crumbled. She told him everything. She spoke of their father's drinking after their mother died, of his eventual disappearance, and of the eviction notice that had been the final, brutal blow. She described nights spent sleeping in a car, the constant hunger, and the terror of being two young girls alone in a world that didn't care. It wasn't an accusation or a plea for pity. It was a testament of trust, an offering of her deepest wounds to the man who had just helped heal her sisters. From that night on, something fundamental shifted. The invisible lines that had separated them dissolved, replaced by a deep, unspoken bond. They were no longer a property owner and his temporary help. They were a unit. Navigating the wreckage of their pasts together, laughter began to fill the dusty spaces in the house. Tentative at first, then more frequent and full, William taught Grace how to use a power drill, and she showed him the delicate details in her sketches. Clara, whose knowledge of plants came from a place of survival, began teaching Chloe the names of edible berries and wildflowers. The house was still a mess of unfinished projects and looming expenses, but it was no longer empty. It was slowly, painstakingly, becoming a home. The storm arrived without the courtesy of a warning, a sudden, violent assault that seemed intent on tearing their fragile world apart. The wind screamed through the gaps in the old window frames, a mournful, angry sound that rattled the very bones of the house. Rain came down not in sheets, but in solid, punishing waves that hammered the tin roof with the force of 1,000 fists. Inside, the four of them were huddled in the living room, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows that made the familiar space feel menacing and strange. Then came a sound that was not the storm, a sickening crack from upstairs followed by a splintering groan. It was the sound of the house surrendering, a final, weary sigh from the old structure as it gave in to the relentless pressure. A moment of stunned silence, and then another sound, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, the unmistakable rush of water where it should not be. William was the first to move, his heart seizing with a cold dread that was sickeningly familiar. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his mind a maelstrom of worst-case scenarios, all of them centered on Chloe. He threw open her bedroom door to a scene of pure chaos. A huge, dark stain was spreading across the ceiling, and from a jagged crack in the center, water was pouring down in a steady, determined stream directly onto his daughter's bed. Chloe sat bolt upright, clutching her teddy bear, her small face a mask of terror as chunks of wet plaster fell around her. For William, time fractured. He wasn't in the farmhouse anymore. He was on a rain-slicked highway, surrounded by the shriek of metal and the flashing red and blue lights, utterly powerless as the world he knew was ripped away. The same suffocating helplessness clamped down on his chest, rooting him to the spot, a spectator to another disaster he was failing to prevent. While William was lost in the ghost of his past, Clara moved with the swift, decisive energy of someone long accustomed to crisis. There was no panic in her eyes, only a fierce, focused resolve. She swept past him, her voice cutting through the noise of the storm, sharp and clear. "Chloe, come to me. Now!" She scooped the little girl out of the drenched bed and into her arms, turning to hand her to a wide-eyed Grace who had followed them up the stairs. "Get her downstairs," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. Then she turned back to the room, her gaze assessing the damage with a builder's practicality. "William, we need every bucket we have, and the big tarp from the barn. Move!" Her words were not a request, they were an anchor, a solid point of command in the swirling chaos that had threatened to drown him. They worked for what felt like hours, a frantic, synchronized ballet of buckets and tarps, their movements guided by Clara's calm instructions. When the deluge was finally reduced to a manageable drip, the adrenaline receded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the stark reality of the damage. William slid down the hallway wall, his head in his hands, the fight finally gone out of him. A single, ragged sob escaped his lips. "I can't do this," he whispered to the floorboards, the confession raw and broken. "I couldn't protect her. I can't protect you. I'm going to fail you all, just like I failed Sarah." He didn't see Clara kneel in front of him until her hand rested on his shoulder, her grip surprisingly strong. She waited until he looked up, his eyes swimming with grief. "You're not alone this time," she said, her voice steady and sure, devoid of pity, but full of unshakable conviction. "We're your family too." Her words were not a comfort. They were a revelation. They landed in the hollow space of his grief and filled it with something solid and real. William looked at her, at this fierce, resilient young woman who had faced down the storm both outside and within his own heart, and he saw not a stranger he had taken in, but a daughter. His gaze shifted to Grace, who was wrapping a dry blanket around a now sleeping Chloe on the sofa. In the quiet, dripping aftermath of the storm, surrounded by the wreckage of his roof, William felt a profound sense of peace settle over him for the first time in years. The house was broken, more broken than ever, but the fragile collection of people within its walls was not. They were forged into something new, something stronger than wood and nails, sealed by a shared crisis and the quiet declaration that they belonged to each other. He was home. The morning after the storm, the sun rose on a scene of devastation, but inside the house, the atmosphere was one of quiet determination. The roof was a gaping wound, and their savings were all but gone. Despair was a luxury they couldn't afford. It was Clara who first saw the solution, not by looking up at the ruined roof, but by looking out at the rain-soaked earth. She spoke of the land's fertility, of the things they could grow, not just for themselves, but to sell. The idea caught fire. William, the engineer, began sketching out irrigation plans on a damp napkin. Grace, the artist, imagined a logo, a simple, hopeful design. They decided, standing together amidst the debris, that this place was no longer just Stillwater Creek Farm, a name tied to a stagnant past. From that day forward, it would be Hopewell Creek Farm, a name chosen for the future they were determined to build together. The work that followed was relentless, fueled by a shared purpose that made every aching muscle and blistered hand feel like a small victory. They tilled the soil that had been choked by weeds for years, planting neat rows of vegetables and herbs. Their first stall at the local farmers' market was a humble affair, but the freshness of their produce and the quiet dignity of their family story began to win over the community. Even Henderson, their once suspicious neighbor, became a regular customer, his gruff demeanor softening with each passing week. That autumn, as the first vibrant orange pumpkins dotted their fields, William sat down with a lawyer. The papers he filed weren't about property or business. They were about family. He began the official process of becoming Clara and Grace's legal guardian, a quiet, deliberate act to make permanent the bond that had been forged in a storm and nurtured in the rich soil of their new home. 5 years transformed Hopewell Creek Farm into a local landmark. The house stood proud and whole, its porch no longer sagging, but adorned with pots of Grace's flowers, a tire swing hanging from the old oak, just as Sarah had once dreamed. Chloe, now 12, moved with the easy confidence of a girl who had never known a day without the love of her 2 older sisters. Clara, home from her agricultural science classes, managed the now thriving business, her old distrust replaced by a capable, warm authority. She had even started a small apprenticeship program, offering a safe place for other kids who'd been dealt a bad hand. Grace, at 21, had her own small studio in the renovated barn, her canvases capturing the vibrant life of the farm in brilliant color. William, his face lined with laughter instead of grief, would often stand by the fence, watching his 3 daughters, a quiet, profound peace settling in his heart. He realized then that the broken-down house he'd bought wasn't a tomb for his past, but a crucible for his future. The terrible, hollowing loss of his wife had, in some unknowable way, cleared a space for this new, unexpected family to grow. True family, he understood, wasn't about the absence of pain or the preservation of what was. It was built in the aftermath, with the courage to gather the broken pieces and the grace to see that they could be reassembled into something even stronger, something more beautiful. His grief for Sarah would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. Love did. Stories like this remind us that even from the deepest sorrow, a new purpose can bloom. Thank you for letting us share this journey with you. Subscribing is what allows us to continue bringing these testaments of hope to light.